to greet you for a special featured program as part of the Mount summer program. I wanted to just share a little bit of the thinking behind this. The theme for the many of this room who are part of the summer program is kings, queens, and gems. And the thought was, we're speaking about power and the impact and the influence that individuals can have on those around them, whether it's a position of control, a king or a queen, a jack, meaning an advisor, someone who can influence others. And we were trying to think, how do we relate that to modern day? When many of us, maybe you're British, so perhaps it's slightly different, but for many of us, we haven't lived under a king or queen, but we've certainly lived with many leaders and many degrees of influence. And that's why we brought these two wonderful, impressive people here today to speak about those rings and ripple effects of leadership in the community setting, as well as influence in the realm of journalism, which both of our guests here have much to speak about. So I'm going to take as little time as possible. I do want to share about who they are and why we brought them here, and then I will hand over the microphone so we can begin. So first we have Rabbi Benji, Levy, welcome. He is the co-founder of Israel Impact Partners, working with leading funders to accelerate the growth of nonprofits. He founded a new show in Katamon called Hilat Eretz Chandak, an AI startup called Tana, an interdisciplinary mental health center with his wife called Kesha, and has written 3 books, his most recent with Dr. Erica Brown. He served as CEO of Mosaic United and served as Dean of Moria College in Sydney, Australia. Rabbi Benji was named as one of 3 top global changemakers by leading Israeli newspaper Makor Rishon, and awarded Educator of the Year by JNF for his leadership and service. He is a reservist in the IDF spokesperson unit and currently lives in Jerusalem with his wife and children. Rabbanit Avital Chizhik-Goldschmidt, welcome, is a writer living in New York City. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, New York Times, Foreign Policy, The New Republic, Vox, Vogue, Salon, Glamour, Business Insider, Los Angeles Review of Books, Jewish Review of Books, and Religion and Politics, among others. Previously, she was a life editor at The Forward and a reporter for Haaretz. She is a recipient of honors from The Atlantic, the National Foundation for Advancement in the Arts, and the Religion Association. Avital has taught journalism at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and at Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women. And her fiction has appeared in Fiction Magazine, The Florida Review, Tablet, and Moment. Avital does pastoral work alongside her husband, Rabbi Benjamin Goldschmidt, in the synagogue they co-founded, the Alt-New on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Thank you so much to both of you for being here, and we are looking forward to a very enriching conversation. Thank you, Serena.
Thank you. Really thank you, Serena and Matan, for hosting us, and to all of you for coming, both online and in person. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be here. But since my esteemed co-panelist does so much interviewing and writing about others, I thought I'd take the opportunity to really interview her today.
Thank you for giving me the break.
Well, it's actually the opposite.
All right.
You're going to do all the speaking. I just get to ask the question. So I guess let's start from the beginning. You know, what's a good Jewish religious girl like you doing, writing in the Atlantic and the New York Times, and as a lead journalist for our Times? Tell us your story. Let us get to know you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Matan, for hosting this, for organizing this. This is very special. Karina and Chaya for making this happen. And I have to acknowledge my mother-in-law who's sitting in this room, Chizhik-Goldschmidt. So, and she's going to laugh because she knows the story very well, how I got into journalism. I was always a writer ever since I was a child. My parents are immigrants from the Soviet Union. And I mention this because it's a big part of why I think I chose to become a writer. I grew up with a real admiration of great writers and thinkers in the way that many Soviet Jews sort of tend to do, and specifically nonconformist writers. for Soviet Jews, the greatest, luminaries were the writers, the Jewish writers who were nonconformists and who were able to ask the difficult questions even at great costs. So I grew up with a real admiration of those writers, but also the great Russians. I read War and Peace when I was 12 years old, and I was told I was a slacker because I read it in translation. I didn't read it in the original Russian and French, but that was really the world that I grew up in, a world where refugees came with suitcases filled with books. There was no room for clothing. You just took your precious books with you. So that was really my upbringing. And as my parents became they became observant as I was a child, I remember one of my most vivid memories was I couldn't process how hard it is to sort of not write on Shabbat. I needed to write on Shabbat. For me, writing was, and I remember when I was like 7 years old, I actually wrote secretly once on Shabbat because it just felt to me so important. Of course, over the years, I understood that Shabbos is probably the best thing for one's creativity, to let those ideas really simmer without any actual productivity. But I really feel it was from a very young age. When I was 20 years old, I sort of competed in competitions nationally in America. And then when I was 20 years old, I submitted an essay about a very uncontroversial subject called tznius to Tablet magazine. I was in Stern College at the time, and the essay was accepted. It was published, if you remember, I'm sure many people in this room do, during the riots in Beit Shemesh. This is in 2012, and it was it was like really, it struck a nerve, I would say. And this was a time when things really would go viral on Facebook. And I was overwhelmed by the response, and people really, a lot of people felt, wow, you really said something, you voiced something. The essay was really about stringency, the culture of religious stringency, and the way that basically that people, and I think specifically women and in women's universes, that we use chumras, or sort of, we want to out-Jones each other, we want to out from each other always, and the way that toxic culture that is created from that reality, and that piece really went viral. It got a lot of great responses, but then also, of course, some really difficult responses, including probably most importantly, you're never going to get married after. That was the worst part of all. But that was when I was 20 years old, and I sort of decided I'm going to take a break from writing. I can't do this. It was very suffocating, I think, especially in the Jewish community and religious community, and again, as a single young woman trying to find my place to sort of try to lead a life of integrity in which I can really speak about issues that I care about, while also sort of surviving the scrutiny that happens as a result of that. It was very difficult. And so I stopped for a few months, but then I ended up writing another essay about a boy that I had dated who had broken my heart because he felt I was not firm enough, I was too outspoken, and I was too feminist. And I wrote, and that essay landed in the New York Times, and I was 21 years old. Long story short, he came back 2 years later, and now we have 3 children. So that's the long story short. But I
looking at his mouth.
There's nothing new here. So that's really how I started, I would say. Actually, shortly after that New York Times essay, I was 21 years old. The editor-in-chief of Haaretz, Elizabeth Ben, wrote an editorial with which I disagreed virulently. And I wrote a letter to the editor that was very, very arrogant, as a 21-year-old would write. And they published it, and they said, we're publishing your response, but we would like to meet with you. So I met with them, and they offered me to become a contributor, a regular contributor. They were specifically looking for an Orthodox voice, and I think ideally they were looking for a female Orthodox voice. So I started writing for Haaretz for 5 years. And I did a lot of really interesting, fun work for them. And then after that, I went to become an editor at the Forward. I edited features there. And then in 2021, I left I wanted to be a little bit working with a larger audience, so to speak. So I started freelancing for the magazines that Serena listed. And now I'm working on a book.
Amazing. So it's quite a story, and I think it's very reminiscent sitting here in Matan, where Tanakh is really the focus of a lot of the learning of a lot of Nevi'im. and their role really, writing wasn't obviously as rampant then. Most people didn't have the capacity to write, but they were orators and they were there to really be social critics of the time and to imagine a future. A lot of that social criticism reflected some type of conflict or tension between where they thought the world should be and where the world was. And sometimes, it happened and it came to be. And ideally it didn't. Ideally they could give Musar, they could give, beautiful instruction and rebuke to the people such that their prophecies wouldn't happen because they would be able to actually live up to it. And I guess what that outlines for a writer, for a social critic, for a Navi then, and for who you are now, it really represents a conflict or a tension between who one is and what is out there. Can you share anything about your conflict between your own religious identity, your career, and the world at large?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful point. I've written a little bit about this specifically. I wouldn't suppose or sort of be that arrogant to say that I am like Yirmiyahu, but I do feel his rage sometimes. And I've written about actually specifically, I think it was a few years ago, during a moment of great turmoil in the States around immigration. And there were some really pretty bad human rights violations that were coming out in the news, and I wrote about sort of my struggle with my own community in talking about human rights and feeling the rage of the Nevi'im screaming, "There's Shul Mishpat," where is that? Why have we lost sight of that? So I think it's a very fundamental question I am asking. It's a very difficult tension to live in, and I learned by now 10 years in that I have to sort of take time to step back, breathe, recalibrate, and then come back onto stage. I can't always be that raging voice that I think people often imagine journalists to be. I've definitely over the years experienced a lot of pushback, and downright threats over the years, unfortunately, from within the community. Being a Rabbanit as well puts me into a position of a lot of scrutiny. Being on the Upper East Side, where you have a little bit of a political who's who, it's also complicated because I can have a political view that's one way, and then someone of the opposite political view can be sitting next to me in shul. So the tensions and the stakes are always very high, but at the same time, I think it builds a lot of accountability. Because I know that whatever I write, whatever I say publicly, I'm going to have to face a person from the other side tomorrow at a wedding when we're going to sit together, right? I can't just sit in my hole tweeting away like I think many journalists do, where they live in these bubbles and they don't really ever interact with someone who has different opinions from them. So I think it's a difficult balancing act, but it's an important one.
I'm just thinking, you mentioned before that you wrote with Haaretz and you wrote a tablet, and then you wanted to expand, you wanted to broaden your reach. Yeah. And one of my personal, I don't know what the word is, issues with the generation is I feel like we have the greatest product, we're the worst salesman. And I feel like at the end of the day, I was the head of a school with 1,800 students, and I was actually reflecting with someone on the way in here about their own literacy and their own learning journey. And a lot of the apathy, a lot of the assimilation, a lot of the ignorance is largely our fault. Us being leaders, us being educators, etc. And you chose to really go for a much broader audience, which makes a lot of sense and has that value. But I'm interested in the tension between that broader audience. On the other hand, we're going to get Rabbi when we get in, you're the Rebbetzin of Shul, and you have your micro audience, your few hundred people that you can really invest and grow. You got your broad audience too, they're very broad. But then there's the in-between. I'm not saying necessarily it's a Haaretz or Tablet magazine or a school, but bigger than a school or a shul. And I'm just interested why you decided to devote your energy at this stage of your life to a broader, often non-Jewish audience, as opposed to looking more at within the Jews that we're losing in that sense.
So my answer to you is a little bit cynical. Prepare yourself. Jews love to read about Jewish things in non-Jewish publications. A lot of time. One thing I've learned. There was a reporter.
May I
design
ask
that used to say
something?
that inside the newsroom,
From Zoom, and may I ask
people
something
love
from
stories.
Zoom?
There are two topics. That the
Hello?
reporters know their metrics are gonna blow up, and journalism today is all about metrics, not actually about content. We'll get to that later
Can-
perhaps. But he used
Can
to say
Zoom
that if
ask
you write a story
something?
about dogs, people would love it.
No.
And if you would write a story about Yiddish language, the metrics would go wild. So someone had to figure out how to write a story about a dog that speaks Yiddish. And that story really blew it out of the park. So I think, which really illustrates the point that I think we Jews love to read about ourselves in big publications. Oh, look, we made it into the New Yorker. And we can analyze the psychology there, right? Why would that so important to us? Why are we not happy with something in the shtetl newspaper? But that's just how we are, and I think we've always been that way. So I feel going for a broader audience doesn't in any way detract from a Jewish audience. It just, I think actually you do reach many more, I would say, unaffiliated Jews that way. And I think even when I write about topics that are, let's say, difficult, unpalatable, critical sometimes about Jewish issues, I believe there's a real opportunity to make a Kiddush Hashem. This is going to sound strange, but to my mind, when in mainstream media, readers see a religious Jewish person talking about issues in their community, then there's a model of someone who's saying, hey, there's a problem and I'm talking about it and I'm dealing with it. I'm trying to find a solution for it, rather than shoving it under the rug, which is unfortunately often the case.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I remember a few years ago, I was sitting in Rabbi Saxon's home and I had the opportunity to speak to him. I was very close to him. And we were reflecting on the fact that the Jewish world took him much more seriously when the non-Jewish world took him very seriously.
Exactly.
Whether it's in the House of Lords, whether it's prime ministers, and whether it's in BBC and broader things. So I think it's definitely true. Is there any specific article that you can reflect on? You've written so much, and you already shared one when you're in your early 20s. Is there any other article that you feel sort of had a ripple effect, had an impact that you're either proud of or you'd like to share with us?
So I'm asked this question a lot, and it's like choosing a favorite child sometimes. I really feel very invested in most of my pieces that I really.
Who is the favorite child? Okay.
That we pour our heart into. I think, but the most important piece I think I stand by this is the article I wrote on abortion in From Community in 2018. And I actually now reflecting on it, understand that it's the most important article for me because there's a pastoral element to it as well. I did a story. This is when Roe v. Wade was, they were fighting over the heartbeat bill in Iowa. This is before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I saw a lot of chatter from community channels discussing the usual platitudes one way or another on the abortion debate. And I felt this whole thing is so ridiculous. A childbearing age woman in the From community and a Rebbetzin know that this happens in our community. I mean, I have friends who have gone through this. We from time to time, there are questions that come up. Someone has to talk about this and do it in a way that is not another op-ed, another 800-word, snappy, angry article that will convince absolutely no one, right? I'm going to do something totally different. And what I did was I started putting out feelers within my very close networks of asking for frum women to, if they are ready to share their stories anonymously with no identifying details of choosing to terminate a pregnancy and what that experience was like. And also what I was really curious about, whether they had pastoral support, halachic support, was there a posting involved, etc. And the story had about a dozen testimonies in the end, and the women were from really all over, I would say, the map. It was a very gut-wrenching story to really report. Some women wrote their stories on their own, some women I interviewed, and I sort of did it as told to. But that story really, I would say, continues to be quoted to this day. I get a lot of people writing to me saying that they actually teach this, they hand out this article when they give a shiur on abortion. And a lot of mental health professionals in the From community have also told me how important this article was for them. Because it really just named something that no one was sort of really naming, right? And I think that's at the core, that's what journalism should be. It's just naming the realities in our communities without without passing judgment. Just be aware that the person sitting next to you at the Shabbos table may have gone through this. So when you go on a political tirade, perhaps consider it's not so simple.
Amazing. So, you know, that was an article that was seminal, both for you and to influence so many and to share that. If tomorrow was 2 years instead of 24 hours, and you didn't have your children and your husband and your life and all your responsibilities, and you could write another 3 or 4 really important articles for the times now, for the next year, you know, what would those topics be? And what, like, you know, you don't have to do the whole article, but, you know, what's the 1 sentence angle that you think is not being written about by people like us or for an audience, and that should be?
It's a good question. I think, and perhaps this relates to where our conversation is going to go, I'm assuming. I think one of the things I'm most fascinated by right now at this moment in my life is the role of religion today, period. I live in living in Manhattan exposes me to a very diverse universe, and as a journalist and sort of in some circles that I am in, they're extremely, extremely secular. And then, but I go there as I am, right? And I have this sort of dichotomy in my life. And I almost wish people would understand how absolutely transformative and uplifting, and I think life-saving, life-affirming, true faith and true community can be. Especially in a post-COVID world, which is something that my husband and I really sort of have seen up close since building a shul 1.5 years ago in Manhattan. We've been shocked by the response. And that's something I'm thinking about a lot. And I think that it's not really being communicated in an eloquent way, in a language that speaks to a wider audience.
It's almost, that's like a topic that's almost been tried and tested, and sometimes it almost becomes cliche, like,
It does.
Shabbos, you know, I'll just disconnect to reconnect and all these
Exactly.
attitudes. So what is the angle? How do you think you can articulate it?
You're gonna have to read it. I'm giving it to you. But 100%. It's right. I think there is a sophisticated way of talking about the absolute relevance of religion for a sophisticated cosmopolitan person today, for sure. I think today ever more than ever before in some ways. I think you're right. I think a lot of times, and now I'm sort of switching hats as a sort of, we don't use the word kiruv, but you know, people who are busy with outreach. One of the big mistakes I see is that people often talk about religion in this very simplistic way, exactly as you said, Shabbos is so amazing, it's the best thing ever, it's gonna be the best thing for your family. There are all these promises, there are all these sort of guarantees that I see people who I see as colleagues, but at the same time, it's very hard for me to understand how they can do that as simply as they do, knowing that the reality is not always so simple, right? I often, especially by the way, in women's issues and circles, I see all the time people, whether it's talking about mishpacha or it's you, all these issues that, you know, obviously there's great value in them, but they're hard sometimes. And to promise that these things are always going to be amazing and your life is going to change. By the way, I often get the disillusioned graduates of those programs, right? They come to us saying, well, you know, my marriage wasn't solved by this. Shkaya, of course it's not going to be solved by this. I'm doing this, even though it's hard. Come with me on that journey. That I think is really the language that we should be using.
Yeah, I think it's ironic because the first pure person / patriarch of / father of monotheism is Avram. He's given these incredible promises from God to have kids, to have a big nation, to have land. And then he's just put through trials and tribulations and it sucks. Like, life's really tough for him.
Life is tough.
And I think that at the end of the day, if Avram and Sarah are put through those trials and tribulations, as Hashem himself has made that promise, there's a deep message in it for each and every one of us. And that is that, you know, reaching that destination doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. And it doesn't mean that every step is going to be
even if you wear a t-shirt that says thank you Hashem. Life will still be hard. Yes, I think there, unfortunately, a lot of Judaism has sort of been distilled into these sort of fast 2-minute long sound bites that really lose the sophistication and the complexity that a lot of people are actually seeking.
Oh, well, the depth of the words thank you Hashem is tough in and of itself, in that, you know, at the end of the day, as hard as it is, we're meant to also thank Hashem and also say brachot on difficult things.
Right.
So it's a different, so it's reframing that concept.
Yeah.
You know, as a writer, you really choose words very carefully, and I noticed that you said we don't like to use the word kiruv, but then you use the word outreach. Do you think that the word kiruv has been tainted in any way, in terms of from others' usage, from other reputationally? And if so, do you think it's redeemable? Do you think the word in and of itself is inappropriate, incorrect? For the outreach work that you do, how do you frame that, and how does the word kiruv fit into it?
Great question. I think I have no issue with the actual word. Kiruv, closeness, is exactly what this is about. I think it's just the association has gotten to be very complicated for people. I see many people who go through sort of the system and it doesn't always work for them. Or there are a lot of disillusionments that happen along the way. And I don't know, I think it's complicated. I think the people who intend to go into this are not always the best suited for this type of work. I think there's a lot of messianic complexes of individuals who go into outreach, and I think there needs to be more humility in it. So for me, the association is not great, I would say. I think it's a little bit arrogant, and you know, it's really funny because I'm always in different situations, and sometimes I sit with other Rabbanits who are also quote unquote kiruv, and the conversation is always like, so how many people do you have for Shabbos every week? How many people do you host for dinner? How many people have you made shomer Shabbos? Like, there are metrics, there's, you know, certain, you know, standards you have to meet. And I don't look at it that way at all. These are my friends. The people in my community are my friends. I don't see them as projects. And I think that's a really important shift that people in this work have to have.
Do you think it's a problem? Meaning there's very significant donors and organizations that literally have metrics that literally want to know how many people are now going to a shiva or seminary or putting together in lighting candles. Do you think that's a negative way to approach Europe?
Good question. I understand the need for it. I understand the need to measure the work that is being done with the incredible generosity that is being put into it. I do think we need to be aware that that's not always the way that we should be really talking about it, especially even amongst ourselves. Like, that's, for example, in our new shul, Baruch Hashem, we have a large membership already. We have a lot of people coming to shul every week, but every time people talk about the numbers, people joke it's the shul in Manhattan, you cannot get a seat after 10:30. You have to get there by 10:30. And it's very nice and it's very exciting, but I always get a little bit uncomfortable with it, to be honest, at this point. Like, that's not the point. That's not the point. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. Am I really helping? Am I really, you know, giving people the support that they need? Am I really giving them the community that they're so seeking in this lonely city?
It's funny because our shul finishes at 10:30. That's a big difference between our
Huge difference.
So I'm interested, you know, when it comes to editing, when it comes to writing, you can work, rework, sit there in the pristine sort of space of the coffee shop or your home on your computer. When it comes to shul, when it comes to your home, it's messy, it's real people, it's all this. I think it's a nice point to transition. Journalism, you have a certain platform, you have a lectern, you're speaking to a significant amount of people. And now, you know, in the last year and a half, you've built together with your husband this incredible shul, the whole new shul. Just tell us the story about it. What happened? I know it looks like you're writing, that was controversial as well. Maybe share a bit of the backstory that went into it, and what's your vision for the shul?
This being recorded. It was in the New York Times, as was our wedding. Yes, it was a fun story. It was a fun story. My husband was an assistant rabbi for 10 years at a synagogue in the Upper East Side, where, thank God, he was very successful, popular, and there was a difference in opinion in terms of succession. And we found ourselves thrown into the street from one day to the next. I was pregnant with our third child. We didn't know what we were going to do. We were in absolute total shock. and the hardest few months of my life, no question about it. And this is November 2021, and we were literally sitting there frozen. We didn't know what to do. And I'll never forget, one of the women from the community called us and she said, "So where are you davening this Shabbos?" We're like, "Where are we davening this Shabbos? We literally don't know what, we have to pay rent. I don't have health insurance. I have to figure out my life." She said, "Wherever you're davening, I'm going with you." And one by one, the community went with us. And it was a very painful time. We're not, controversy in journalism is nothing like controversy in Jewish community. I'll tell you that. Twitter is nothing compared to real life, especially in the Upper East Side, when you're dealing with lawyers, publicity, tabloid reporters, you name it. It's a very interesting experience. But the bottom line is, don't mess with a journalist, Robinson. That's the bottom line. In any event, Baruch Hashem, we started our own shul. We started literally in our living room. We had 40 people show up the first Shabbat, and then the following week we had to rent a space already. And that was it. And then we were renting space every single week. And it just grew organically. I would say we didn't market it, we didn't publicize it. We were just sort of like, we'll continue to work with the people that we built 10 years of relationships with. And it just sort of grew by word of mouth. And I guess that's probably the best marketing you could have, especially in a city like New York, where everyone wants to get into the restaurant but doesn't take reservations, you know. So that's really how it started. Because it was a startup, and I know that you also started a shul, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. I think there was a lot of just the freshness of it, just the ability to be like, yesh me'ayim, like I'm just gonna do whatever, you know, let's start from scratch. Why do we have to do X, Y, and Z? Just because every other shul does it, just because that's what we used to do in the previous shul doesn't mean we have to do that now, right? Let's refocus, let's reframe. We'll focus on the people. We don't have a building yet, but we have excellent software. We don't have the hardware, we have the software. Let's figure that out. So that was really how it started. A year and a half later, thank God, it's really been an incredible journey. And it's I don't know what to say. It's a really exciting new moment. I think people are, especially, one thing I'm actually very proud about, and I'm gonna say it, is that our age demographics are actually exactly proportionate. When we first started, people were like, "Oh, it's going to be the young people shul," and we said, no, this is going to be a shul with every single age, with every single, and we actually did the demographics data, like we ran the data, and we found that our membership falls exactly something like 1/3 under age 36, 1/3 between 36 to 54, maybe 60, and then the last third above that. So we have this really beautifully diverse community, diverse in age, diverse in background, diverse in even like languages. So I find we have a lot of people from many different cultural backgrounds being in New York City. So it's been a really, really fascinating thing to see how, I would say, people, I think, of all ages and all stages in life are looking for energy. Just people always say, when you come into shul, there's energy, there's vibe. That people love that word vibe, there's vibes. But I think it's very true. And that's the beauty of a startup, when you're not dealing with the sort of institutional weights, the baggages, right? You just start fresh. People are excited and they join in and they lead. That's the other beautiful thing. We're really very much a lay-led shul. We have so many lay leaders. The mother of one of them is sitting here, who are really incredible in building what we've been building together.
So what is the X, Y, and Z we call it that you needed to cut out from shul? Like what is,
You're a real journalist, you're getting the hard question.
what do you need to get rid of? And then what is the focus that is a differentiating factor? What's the UVP? In a startup, we always talk about the unique value proposition.
Yeah.
What did you get rid of? What did you keep?
So we have a very, I think, careful balance. We think that shul does not have to be formal, but it can still be elegant. There's a difference. And I think in New York, and especially for young people, that's exciting. We don't have schleppy davening. We don't have very long speeches. It moves at a really good pace. We
How long does your shul take? What time?
it's 2 hours, exactly. 2 hours. And by the way, there are those who are saying, no, we need more time, but it works. What we figured out has worked. There's a lot of singing. It's spiritual, but at the same time, it's still, it's New York, it's the Upper East Side. There's the elegance, I think, that people really still want. They don't want a totally Heimish shtiebel. They want something that's really kind of elevated. I think focusing really strongly on Shabbos and not on just random events, that's been another big thing for us. A lot of shuls think that event planning is community building. Those are two totally different things. Just throwing an event is not building community. Building community is really focusing on what the community needs. And in our case, our community needs Shabbos and they need daily minyan. Like that's the focus. My husband always says, thousands of years ago, he figured out like this really great system. You don't really need to, think of something new. And I know that might sound strange here, but in New York, I think there's a big emphasis on creating some sort of events that draw people, but it ends up being a lot of work and a really big drain on the system when you really should just be focusing, if you ask me, on an excellent Shabbos experience and an experience where people can really connect with one another, make friends, sit together at a meal. One of the most gratifying pieces, I think, of the work that we've been doing is, forget about us, it's seeing people build friendships in shul and coming out that I hear afterwards, oh, we went on vacation with them, we met them here, or we're going out to dinner with them, or we're doing a girls' night, and they're all Altnoy connections. So I think it's very basic, but that's really been our focus. We have a hospitality program where actually a bunch of young couples manage it, basically, where they connect people who need meals with people who host. We have a shadchanas team that works on setting people up. We really are focused on building those relationships. We're not busy with throwing, a cocktail for the sake of having a cocktail. In Manhattan, people don't need another party to go to. Let me tell you, they have enough parties in their lives. They have enough fancy places to go to. They don't need shul for that. They need shul for something much deeper.
Amazing. So, you said you're interested in what we do. I think it's actually quite similar.
Yeah.
We sort of just felt that the part of the birth of the shul was myself and two other individuals couldn't find a shul that we wanted to go to.
Yeah.
And that works for our family. In COVID, I fell into a sort of trap where there was a certain shul that I like to go to once a month because it was tremendous singing, but too long to go to every week. Another shul that I enjoyed, on Friday nights, another shul for Shabbos day. And I used to be able to, if I'm not speaking in a different shul, etc., really keep to myself. But it wasn't something my wife enjoyed. It didn't offer anything for my children. And so that's what we tried to build. We have, first of all, we start our day with learning at 8 a.m. for those that want to, and we get a really nice turnout. And we have a phenomenal rabbi whose mother is here as well, Rabbi Mondre, who gives that shir, shout out to her. And that really grounds and starts experience. That's at 8 a.m. At 8:30 we start davening, but our children's services start at 8:25.
Right.
Because we want the women and the men to both be able to engage and be part of the experience, and we want the children to have a place. Often, it was the last 20 minutes, the last hour, the last half an hour into, and we have multiple children's services with fantastic leaders. And then also our davening, including the Drosh, only takes up to 2 hours, tremendous amount of singing, and then we have a kiddush every week. Like it's a very basic thing.
It's very basic thing.
It's going back to the basics.
For sure. Learning has been a big element of what we've been doing. Exactly. We also have a morning share before. And then the other thing that I started doing that was kind of a crazy idea, but then it became its own thing, was after our kiddush, where we serve a full meal. So people stay for lunch, they go to the bar, they sit with their friends, they make connections. Afterwards, I give a shir, sort of for women, but I always have men joining events. I give a shir every single week on the parsha. And for me, that was also a very important piece where the women feel very emphatically that there is a special program that is for them, that's, it's really puts them first. Men, I always say men can sit in the back. So I think that has also changed things, it's brought a lot of young women, even young women who might wake up late or they're coming from the west side. But they're coming because they know there's still a shiur coming at 1 o'clock and it's worth it to come to shul for that. So, and once the young women are coming, guess who comes then? The young men. So it works. And then also childcare. Childcare is huge. We've been from the very beginning, even when we didn't have anything, we had babysitters every Shabbos, drop off your kids, go to Davin. Because otherwise women aren't going to go to shul. It's very simple.
Very critical of what you said.
Please.
I think it's very important, and we haven't worked out the best wording. But I think, like, at the beginning, someone said, "Do we have babysitters?" And I said, "This can't be babysitters. It shouldn't just be childcare." Because at the end of the day, while that does free parents to go to Davin, the children need to have a learning experience as well. And I think it's also important we develop more around that chinuch approach. We have a shiur once a week on Shabbos, a shiur once a week during the week, just for the kids to make it their space, make it their time. And I think another element is, whether it's the Rabbi Rebbitzin, like, people like hearing us, that's part of why they come. But I think we also have to showcase and create other speakers. So, we had a rabbi, one of the YE Rosh Yeshiva, this Shabbos, as a scholar in residence. We've had tremendous amount, almost every week. I usually only speak once a week, sort of, or maybe twice, depending on the amount of what's going on. And we bring in different people. We've actually, I do a few other things as well, so I can't really do this full time. So we're actually now bringing in a Sephardi Hebrew-speaking rabbi who we're going to pay full time to be at the shul as well. And I think showcasing different voices and showcasing the community, people, as you said, like through the different areas, really engages them. I'm interested. People when they think of a shul often think first of the rabbi. The Rebbitzin plays a critical role in this generation. I think what we've heard you say so eloquently shows the unique voice that a Rebbitzin can truly have. I'd love to understand how would you define that in your specific context and more broadly? What do you see as your role in the shul as a Rebbitzin?
So I want to just preface that I think I'm really sticking at myself personally and not saying that this is what all Rebbitzins should be doing or, ought to be. I think it's such a fraught question, the Rebbitzin problem, right? What do we do with this? A woman who's not necessarily, who hasn't always chosen this, right? So for me, my husband and I feel we really literally co-founded the shul together. This has been a project for the two of us from the very beginning. The voice that the Rebbitzin has is first and foremost representing 50% of the community, and making sure that their needs are heard. For some time, from programming to personal pastoral questions to even basic logistics, right? Making sure that things are accessible, making sure that women feel, comfortable in shul. A lot of shuls in Manhattan are mostly have balconies because there's just limited space. One of the things we've been really makpid on is finding spaces where the entrance, there's a mechitza and you just walk right in, both men and women. There's no, again, in New York, that's not a common thing. If you're either walking with a stroller or you're in a wheelchair, those are things that I'm always worried about. So I think that's just the sensitivity is very important. Then I think, in my case, again, I teach a lot. I teach weekly, I teach monthly class for young women. I'm doing more starting next year. So I have a book club for women that I lead in my home. We have a cultural outings group. We go to Broadway shows and films and museums together. So I'm really busy with working with the women in a way that in the end of the day, Rabbi is never going to do. And I think that's also Rosh Hashanah, that's part of why this has gone where it's gone, because if you don't engage the women, you will not have a strong community. It's very simple. So that's really how I see my role. There are times I've given the sermon as well, which is sort of unusual, I think, especially in New York City after davening. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I do host. I mentioned that last because I don't put that first. That's deliberate. But I do host Shabbos every week. I host a full table every single week. I have my system. But I see it also as my husband and I are hosting together.
is there, if you're thinking about sort of role models for this, because it's not every day that you have a Rabbi that's giving a sermon, that's leading in terms of, all these different cultural outings, etc. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of which other Rabbis I can say that do that. There's not many. Do you have any role models in your life that you look up to, that you say, that I learned from, that they can really inspire the person you've become?
One of them is here in the middle of the room. My mother-in-law, I always joke, but really truly, I feel very blessed that my husband grew up really in the Rabbanit, seeing exactly what it is with all of its beauties and all of its very intense challenges, to the extreme. Growing up in Moscow, his parents built and led the community for 30 years there, with incredible Mesirat Nefesh that I will never understand. Every time I feel something's difficult, then I remember I'm in the Upper East Side, thank God I'm not in Moscow. So I really feel very, very much that my husband's parents are, so often we refer to them, we say, mommy and daddy went through this, or they dealt with that. We compare, we contrast, and I'm not saying that just because you're in the room, I really mean it. It's actually very comforting to know that we're just sort of following in footsteps to some extent. Other role models, I really admire actually Rabbanit Mizrahi. I think she's doing some really groundbreaking work in some very interesting ways, and really reaching a wide audience while being careful with the lines. And I think that's very interesting.
I'm looking forward to your in-laws out new show. When you say, pushing the lines and being careful with the lines, how do you navigate that? Are there certain things that you think are appropriate but you don't do because the world isn't ready for them yet? Or do you feel like you go to whatever you feel is right in terms of those lines?
I actually feel like I'm doing my clothes right now. I think for many years I'm none of it. There were times where I was really always negotiating those things, and now I feel I feel free to just focus on the core of what we're doing, and I really feel we're doing what we feel is right.
So have you ever had any self-doubt when seeing what you're doing? Can you share any inner chambers around that?
I mean, speaking in front of the whole shul, I've definitely gotten criticism for that. That was a decision that we made together for various reasons. And we definitely, I remember we got a phone call after Shabbos one time. What are you doing? What are you, a woman speaking in front of the shul? I'm sharing Bar Torah after that. But some people are still uncomfortable with that. I understand why. But I think if we do, the way we look at things, if we just focus on what we're here for, what we're trying to do, and to make Torah, Judaism accessible to everyone and anyone. Part of it is including women's voices in a way that is logically acceptable. And that's it. I can't get, one thing I've learned really in the hard way, dealing with controversy and being in the eye of the storm, at a certain point you have to filter out the noise. It's very important, because if you let the noise kind of muffle your hearing, you're never going to accomplish anything. And I say that as both a journalist and a Robertson. You have to, at a certain point, just focus on what you believe your topic is, and that's it. So I had self-doubt, certainly, but I think for Hashem, people understand what we're here for, and they understand there's no agenda. There's no agenda other than the word kirub that I am loath to use, but I will use in the sentence.
Do you take Das Torah? Do you have any rabbinic guidance? Who are the people that you consult with making these decisions?
I don't know if I can name them, that's the truth, because they are definitely private conversations. They're not on the record, so to speak. Every time we call someone and Benji says, oh, tell us on the phone, don't worry, it's off the record. She's not writing about this conversation.
How do you feel about that? Meaning that, I actually had a recent conversation with someone who spoke to a certain model about basically organ transplant. And one of the main issues around is when do you define death? Is it brainstem death?
Right, sure.
So my daughter had a liver transplant, so I've learned a little bit about it, both personally and I find it an important area. And they ended up taking these tubes item to the certain hospital and studying with experts, and there was a certain machine that was able to show that brainstem death, no one ever comes out of it.
Yeah.
In ways that certain poskim weren't able to understand now because of the medical advancements we see today. And a week or two later, they met up together, and this Avital said, that they're convinced of, of this, and they weren't before. They didn't understand to this extent. So this person's really excited. They said, "You're going to be able to save so many lives. This is incredible. So will you come out on the record about them?" And they said, "No, my daughter and my granddaughter needs to be able to have shidduch." These are the actual words. And this person turned back to me and said, like, you can't stand idly by when people are dying. You are literally going to have people dying because you don't have the leadership of your community to be able to judge your granddaughter's shidduch because you genuinely believe this is right. You two are scared to share, and I'm not judging these people, I'm not judging, but you said very interestingly that you live your truth. That at the end of the day, when it comes to these decisions, there aren't things like where you actually say, I'm not going to do this because the tzibur isn't ready. You say, this is what I believe is needed, I'm going to do this. How do you feel about leaders that do want to build certain reputations, etc., sometimes at the expense of what they think is right? And how do you feel about that conundrum?
I think we have proven our our ability to really just do the hard thing, even though it's even though it's not necessarily palatable. It's been a big joke in our family, I think, the last year and a half, when between us starting our own shul and sort of shocking the Upper East Side, and then my father-in-law standing up to Putin and saying he refuses to support the war in Ukraine. It's been a really busy year. And it's been a really fascinating experience to sort of go through that inner turmoil and those questions of like, how much are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? And that brings me back to my original point about, I really think my Soviet Jewish background really gave me that question from a very young age. My grandfather was a journalist in Russia, and he would often face real risks for speaking up, for writing something, for saying something on the radio. He had to change his name because his name it's too Jewish sounding to be on Soviet radio. Those were questions we always had to deal with. What are you willing to give up for the truth? I don't want to say that I'm always the best at this. I mean, there's certainly times that I've been afraid. But I really believe Hashem blesses those who stand up for the right things. I've definitely also been on the receiving end of exactly similar situations, thank God, not Pikuach Nefesh, but similar situations to what you described, and it's very disillusioning. But I think it's also very informative for us as hopefully maybe Shani scale, like young leadership, really stepping up to the plate and thinking through, okay, how can I do this differently? How can I be braver? How can I be more sure of myself? And how, in the end of the day, can I have more emunah in Hashem, that I'm just doing the right thing and that I'm not worried about my idea.
Yeah, I mean, I hope some of these people are able to sometimes learn as well. I guess I'd like to pause for a moment before we ask the final question and open up to the audience. We've had a long conversation, and we've only got a few minutes, but I want to see if anyone has any questions they would like to ask of the audience. So I can bring the mic, or you can just call out. So say your name, where you're from, and ask your question.
I'm really excited about what both of you are doing. It's so very exciting, as things are moving along and seeing it happening. And I know there's a lot of challenges that you have. At the same time, I think it's really important to credit and the Rebbitzin or whatever, to credit the Rebbitzins of old, who really had no voice, no recognition, whatever, So when you're asking about who can you credit for do groundbreaking things, it's also important to credit all those Rebbitzins of yore and learn their lessons.
I've written a lot about this. Yeah, I don't have enough time to. Rachel said, Rachel said that we have to credit the Rabbins of yore who were forgotten, you know, and sort of in the annals of history. So funny, my son plays with the Dolan cards, you know, the trading cards with rabbis. And I was looking at them one day and I said, where do you think the Rabbitsons are? We were in these cards. And he thought about it and he said, yeah, Rabbitsons do so much work. I was amazed that he was so perceptive, obviously. So he saw at home. 100%.
Yeah, and I think also that hopefully people, like that's going to become more public as the times have changed and they deserve more and more recognition. And I think we as a community need to think of ways to be able to recognize that much more. But they need to pay testimony. 100%. Well,
and I was wondering about all these wonderful things you'll do to and to grow. Do you charge membership? And when do you decide to charge membership?
Absolutely.
And who pays that weekly ticket?
Oh, 100%.
I've been up to the neighbor for years, and they only have a kiddush, Rosh Chodesh, sponsored by 7 names and it's. There's like 3,000. But I'm concerned because in other tools, it's open to all the time, and there are people who know there will be a free meal and it's up for the free meal.
You hit the toughest question today. So no one wants to talk about shul building, but yes, we charge membership and we charge from the very beginning. And we actually, our board, not us, decided to charge the upper, I would say the upper range of memberships in Manhattan, which was a very audacious thing to do for a shul that did not have a building yet. Okay, but people. I think there was sort of questions, you know, who do they think they are? Baruch Hashem at this point, no, people understand. It's costly to build a shul. We're paying, I mean, our expenses are obviously high, and what I think people gain is great. I mean, I don't like to, I'm not a salesperson, but
I'm getting my point.
yeah,
You all know what she does. I have 2 daughters.
sure.
I'm a pulpit rabbi wife
Mhm.
since 32 years. So I know that part, but I'm talking about the bills have to be there, air conditioning, the guy who cleans up after, the guy who sets the room after, and you're serving Kiddush lunch, you're not serving
Kiddush lunch.
That's a lot of food.
We have sponsors every single week. Think about it. We have one, usually it's 1 or 2 sponsors every week, which is very nice.
Another question is, first is married.
Yes, we have different rates for singles, for young couples, for sure. And also, we always make it very clear that, you know, if it's an issue, we're flexible. The point being that people should really commit to the community. In Manhattan, people often, you have a lot of shul hopping, sort of what you were describing, and we're trying to get people to commit. And we actually say, you don't have to commit to another shul. Every shul works for you, but commit, because that's the only way you're going to build a real community. And especially by the way, you're single and you're looking to meet someone, if you can't commit to a goal, you're going to have trouble committing to one person.
it's symbolic of society.
Yeah.
Like,
It's just for sure.
I'm just going to jump to the back. Yes.
All annoying.
Eretz Chendar. Eretz Chendar. It's about a 5-minute walk. Yes.
Hi, Toby Klein Greenwald. I live in a front, I'm also journalist, as you know. Talk about Charcoal. My simple question was going to be, why did you choose that well-known name of the Alton Journal? But since you mentioned the cards, have you written or will you be writing anything publicly about this issue, how women's faces are totally erased from an entire segment of certain Hebras publications?
Great question. I'll repeat the question. Yeah. First question of the name, I'll say very briefly. My husband is a descendant of the Maharel, so we did want to sort of acknowledge that, but more really the name spoke to us, Alt and Noi. We want to retain the old and bring in the new, in the words of Rav Kook, to make the old new and to make the new holy. That's our sort of our slogan, so to speak. And we also named it because the Alt Noi and proud for the same reason. We love that it's actually Al T'nai that one day will come to Yerushalayim. So we really wanted to inject the Avital Israel into the name, and my husband announced that when we named the shul. And we didn't even talk about the role Israel really plays in the shul, though. It was a very good conversation. To your point about women's erasure, I've been speaking about this topic and writing about it for a decade. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think it's going in. I don't know. I'm very cynical about it at this point. I spent a lot of time screaming, and I think that comes back to this point where actually to shul building. I think in many ways I spent my youth raising my voice a lot and taking on these issues with the passion of someone in that stage of life. And at a certain point, I understood that I'm not sure how many people I'm really reaching. I think I have some influence, but I'm going to continue talking about these things. Don't get me wrong. But at a certain point, I felt like my role is perhaps to also stop preaching and start doing. So I hope, I don't know, my dream is that in building a shul and in building a real life space, not just another Twitter, not just another group, not just another place for chatter online that goes nowhere, but a real space where people can gather, can create a new reality, can discuss these issues with civility and with respect. I think that's really my current goal. But these are huge issues, and I think, honestly, I think taking a visible role in the community, and I'm telling you, it's not as easy or glamorous as it seems, is also sort of a statement against that exact trend that you are describing.
Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Sarah. I live in Jerusalem now. I'm from New York originally. My name's Sarah. Hi. I wanted to ask to jump off of how you said you transitioned to a different kind of role, and in terms of journalism, how you still do find story ideas and kind of still follow that gut in a very different role, and where you look for that, how you know, and also how you split your time, meaning if you're so focused on community, how does that come out?
So time is everything. The question is where I find inspiration for stories and how I split my time. Right. Inspiration for stories is comes from real life. You have to be out there. I was actually just heard the Israeli writer Shlomo on Thursday night in Yaffo, and he spoke about. He made a joke that he was sporting a nice suntan, and he said that all his friends were saying, "Ma'ima shiduk, like you're a writer. You're supposed to be like Kafka, sitting in a basement, white and sickly." And he was laughing, and he said, no, a real writer has to go out there and speak to people and hear from them. And that also kind of is an interesting overlap with my two lives. I really feel a lot of many of my stories come from just being out in the world and meeting people and listening to them, just listening to them. Of course, I think I did more of this in previous years. I'm trying less now for my mental health. Social media is also a great source, of course, of stories, trend, what people are talking about, what keeps them up at night. But I think the best thing of all is really just getting out there in person to talking to people. And then in terms of time, I have a pretty strict schedule. I try to keep to 9 to 1 every single day is devoted to my writing alone. And then after that, I do community work. So I have like a 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock coffee slot with a community member, but until the morning I have to write. If I don't write every single day, I feel out of balance, and I'm just not a nice person to talk to. You don't want to talk to me.
What you like before now?
Before that.
We've got time for one more question. Is there anyone? Yes.
Hi, I'm also Sarah. What do you see the 3 big issues coming up for Orthodox women in the next couple years?
Great
And how is it
question.
different? That's in the United States, and if it's
Yeah.
different from, what do you see the 3 issues coming up for Orthodox women?
Ladies first.
Thanks. Chivalry is not dead. So I think erasure / visibility, number 1, for sure.
Say that again.
Erasure of women in public spaces and increasing Orthodox communities. I think it's growing into way beyond from where it started, and it's growing into mainstream communities. For sure, it's number one, and that has great implications for other things. Abuse, agunos, all these things will continue to fester as long as women are not seen and heard. Very simple. So I really do think what Toby mentioned, this issue of erasure is really just that. I mean, there's just this very strange fear of women in power. It's not just unique to our community, it's true everywhere. And that has much life and death, I think, consequences for the community.
And Benji in Israel, Rabbi Benji?
I think, yeah, I also experienced as a man this weird fear of women.
It should be.
No, I genuinely don't understand it. Like when we started the show, there are people that are just, they don't understand, like a VAD shouldn't have a woman on. Why? Like there's female politicians and lecturers and doctors and everything. What's the difference? And there's actually depth to the answer as to what they say, which I'm grappling with, but I think is very important for all of us to think about. And basically their response is, if you look around at sociologically, that one person I spoke to used the word empirical, which I don't know if he knows the meaning of the word empirical, but he believes that if you look around sociologically, a lot of the frumma, more religious people, like the devotion that their children have to Torah and religiosity, come from places that put women second. Right? It's terrible, right? It's terrible to say that loud, and it should be offensive to all of our sensibilities. But that's what this person said to me. Whereas when you look at, certain, youth movements that are more mixed and people that give, like it often goes hand in hand. And what happens is, in the Dati Leumi community, you've got people that just go Haredi, people that go what they call Chardal, because they're scared of being associated with someone who wears a kippah sruga and also holds his girlfriend's hand in the street, who's also wearing pants in Ben Yehuda. And therefore what happens is, as a reaction to that, almost like, the whole birth of ultra-Orthodoxy was the original reform. It was a reaction to emancipation, enlightenment, all these different types of things. So even within the Frum community, there's a reaction like that. And they say, I'd rather my children have this passion. Obviously there's exceptions, but this sort of road that, my Rabbi, whether it was, Rabbi Sachs or Rabbi Avital or Rabbi Lichtenstein, like the type of rabbis that I learned from personally, or even some of the greats, whether it's Rav Kook, whether it's Rav Soloveitchik, these are men, right? Rav Lichtenstein's daughter ultimately, runs Migdal Oz, and he taught women, but at the end of the day, they think that's such a fine, narrow line. It's such a gray point that's so hard to balance on. Rather just stay away from the cliff entirely. Instead of putting a fence on the cliff, let's go back to here, and that protects us. And I think that on the one hand, I can understand and empathize sociologically what they're explaining. On the other hand, my heart and my soul react so vividly and viscerally against it. And I say to them, Sydney, Australia is a different discussion. But, New York City or Jerusalem, if you can't create the ideal of what you want to have in Yerushalayim in 2023, then when can you? And I think that we need to have more examples of people that are absolutely, dedicated to halacha, but also just as much so see within that dedication to that, their Jewish halacha includes inclusion in the broader sense, not just women and men, but really bringing everyone to the table. And I think, I feel sad because I think at the end of the day, those communities that are neglecting, raising all these types of things with women, it's not just 50% of the population. They're literally like missing out on an intellectual capital, on a whole approach to psikat halacha, to drashot. My wife is an incredible Rebbetzin. She doesn't like to be known as Rebbetzin. Also, her father's rabbi, but she's got an undergrad in psychology, master's in social work. She just finished a postgraduate in couples counseling and sex therapy. And I had a phone call, I don't know, two days ago about a couple that I'm close with that are looking at divorcing. And the first person I went to discuss wasn't my Rosh Kollel, it was my wife. And I actually told him to speak to her, and I think there's a whole unique approach, and there's a whole unique sort of perspective. And I think that at the end of the day, I don't think we need to erase the difference between women and men overall, because I think men bring something unique and women bring something unique. But I also don't think that we should allow the sociological nichshol, this obstacle, from blinding us and from doing that. So I think that other than the general symptoms we see, I think on a causal level, we need bolder leaders, people that really know halakha, that know the Torah, that are willing to stand up and say, this is not our Judaism, this is not our Torah, in a really beautiful way, and never for one iota to go over halakha. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes, you know, the people that are shouting the most aren't those same halachic voices, and that's why I'm excited to be having this conversation, you know, with a Rebbetzin that really stands up and lives up to that. And that's why, to close the conversation in our last 3 minutes, I wanted to ask you to basically reflect. You know, the Gemara says that we get different levels of responsibility, and there's certain achrayot, there's a certain responsibility we have when we're 20 years old. So I'd love you to speak to your 20-year-old self before you won the Stern Prize in the published in Tablet magazine, and ask you, you know, in retrospect, just over a decade later, what advice would you give to that self and other 20-year-old women and men that are coming into this world as we see it today, as they're embarking on their exciting journey?
I kind of already said it, but I'll reframe it. I think I would just say, Al Tira, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of yourself. Don't be afraid of your strengths. Don't be afraid of your talents that Hashem gave you. I think that I went through a lot of times when I was afraid of my own potential, almost sometimes. And I think, and specifically in an era when, I mean, even more so now, I think for 20-year-olds, you live surrounded by so much noise. There's so much noise out there. You live a life that has way too much internet. And it affects you, it affects the way you think, it affects the way you perceive yourself. It affects your goals. I think it actually harms your goals, you know, and I think that's something that I would really wish young people would take more seriously, is letting go of that noise and just really focusing. Who are you? What are you here to accomplish? How are you going to make that happen? How are you going to carve out the time and the focus, the energy, and the concentration to make that happen? I think there were times where I felt a lot of self-doubt because I was just so attacked by this new world, this new age of way too much information and way too much chatter. And I think that ability to put that on pause, to shove it away, to create our own realities is so essential.
I think it's interesting you say Al Tira, because one of the first pasuk that came to mind is Lo Ira, keep Lo Ira,
Yeah.
and I think if you've got a Kadosh Baruch Hu with you and you've got the thousands of generations behind us as we're venturing into this, then we feel less lonely in this generation that has an epidemic of loneliness. And I think you're a real testament to it. So thank you, Rabbanit Avital, for creating the Thank you so much, Serena, for putting this together and for creating such an incredible program. Thank you to my time, and thank you for everyone for joining us in this important conversation.
Thanks to both of you. I think this gave us much to think about, very, very enriching, and asking us the question as we are living our true selves. And I'll also put out there, just as someone who's learned in this space, very much so, if we're thinking about bold leaders and not being afraid and creating an ideal under Shalayim. So many things you said really did remind me of my time and creating that opportunity for women to grow in such an incredible capacity that's comfortable and accepting and warm, and where there doesn't need to be fear. And I appreciate both of you sharing your personal experiences, your wisdom, and thank you again for being here.